Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is June 13th, 2018. So there. June 17th is only 4 days away. Why is that important? It's important for tonight's topic. The bridge. Lost history shown on the 60th tragic anniversary with Mr. George Orr. On June 17th, 1958, the second narrows bridge being built over Burrard Inlet collapsed. 19 men died. It has remained Vancouver's worst industrial accident. 60 years later, all that remains are a few old faded photos, some press clippings, and a sign declaring the bridge as the Ironworkers Memorial. Turns out a young draftsman had filmed the entire project being constructed. He arrived 5 minutes late to the site on the day of the tragedy. Had he arrived on time, he would have died. Peter Hall and his 3,000 feet of 16mm color film was put away the day after the bridge was officially opened and had never been seen until now. The bridge takes Peter's fascinating footage and tells the story of the men whose lives were irrevocably changed that day. Provides a unique look back into a major formative event in Vancouver's history. The Bridge is a collaboration between Peter Hall and award-winning documentary producer George Orr. The film will debut in Vancouver on the 60th anniversary of that terrible day. A truly lost treasure of history has been discovered and brought to the public to inform modern-day Vancouver and provide a lasting memorial to the 19 who lost their lives. George returns to the View Up Here to discuss the project and how, once discovered, he could not deny telling this story. Now, I'll just say right off the top on the show page, there's a link to the film trailer, and there's a link to purchase tickets to, I believe, are now 5 screenings scheduled. Started at 1, now it's up to 5. Also, for the second portion of the show, the Ontario election is over. And we'll look at what's next and what's not with Premier Doug Ford, if anybody can get a real idea at this point. But let's talk about our lead topic. I'm going to give a little bit of background about how the Second Narrows Bridge even came to be designed and constructed. As I light my cigarette. Now, the first bridge across the Second Narrows of Burrard Inlet was completed in 1925. It provided access for cars and trains, but it had a pivoting section that is raised and lowered using counterweights to allow ships to pass, called a bascule. It proved problematic. That bridge was hit numerous times by ships, by the freighter Urana in 1927, by the Norwich City in 1928, and by the Losmar in 1930. In September 1930, the Pacific Gatherer got wedged under the bridge and ripped away the center span. The bridge was sold to the provincial government in 1933, repaired, and reopened in 1934, nearly 4 years after the accident. The bascule was replaced with a center lift span. Now, traffic interruptions were legendary on this bridge. In 1952, some 28,000 boats passed under the bridge, requiring the lift to be raised over 5,000 times. Now, just with a side note, a larger lift bridge was built immediately inland to the east of this original in 1968, and the bridge constructed in 1925 was removed in 1970. Various options were considered to relieve the growing traffic inefficiencies, including a causeway. But the provincial government of the day decided on a new bridge at Second Narrows. It would be located towards the ocean, west of the old Second Narrows Bridge. That bridge was designed by Swan Wooster Engineering. Construction would be a deck-type cantilever, with the roadway supported by steel. Hewitt Raymond were contracted to build the piers, and the Dominion Bridge Company to build the steelworks. Now, Dominion Bridge had built many of Vancouver's early landmarks, including the Hotel Vancouver, the Patullo Bridge, and the Lions Gate Bridge. Construction started on the Second Narrows Bridge, I believe, in 1956. But let's move towards June 17, 1958. Draftsman Peter Hall was late for work that day. His employer, Dominion Bridge, had asked him to bring his wind-up 16mm camera to the job site a few days a week to document the construction. And by June 1958, he'd gathered 3,000 feet of film, which is approximately 90 minutes. But after the bridge came down, the company lost interest in doing anything with the film. Twice, Hall tried to return it to his supervisors, but was rebuffed. It ended up sitting on a shelf for 59 years, until Mr. Hall gave an interview to his local paper in Parksville and mentioned he'd like to see something done with it. Well, that story caught the eye of George Orr. The footage puts the viewer in the boots of the ironworkers themselves. It includes everything from the steel being cut and bound with red-hot rivets at a foundry in Burnaby to cranes hoisting the 55-ton beams up 60 meters over the rushing narrows below. The workers casually lug heavy tools around the narrow girders, but astonishingly, they wore life jackets, not safety harnesses. George Orr spent hundreds of hours editing interviews with the journalists who covered the story at the time, investigators, longshoremen, and salvage divers. But it's the interviews with the survivors that are the most poignant. The pain of the memory is still palpable. George said that was the intent of the story, to get people to care about these old guys. When you watch them talk, you're actually hearing somebody 60 years younger in their memory. As a documentary, it's very much a tribute to the men who died and to the survivors. But it's also partly an engineering lesson and a mystery in its review of the evidence of exactly what went wrong. Now, the first public screenings of the bridge are scheduled to hit the screen at Van City Theatre on June 17th, the 60th anniversary. The second screening is on June 20th, and additional screenings are in the following days. Before I go any further, I'm going to play a little short sound clip of an interview George did with Peter Hall.
Dominion Bridge lost interest in all of that after the collapse, and you can see why. It wasn't a very good advert for them. So anyhow, I just kept the film. I approached at least two managers, and I said, this film doesn't belong to me, but would you like it? And he said no, so I became the custodian of 3,000 feet of film.
There you go. Now I'm just going to do a little more history about some of the survivors, most of which have passed. 10 years ago, in 2008, at the 50th anniversary of the disaster, the Globe and Mail did a bang-up, long-form article. Rod Mickelberg wrote it then. I'm just going to quote from it some of the survivors and their stories then. Norm Atkinson found himself hurtling headfirst into the cold, swirling waters of Burrard Inlet 35 meters below, while massive girders twisted and broke and tumbled down around him. You feel yourself going, and then it's bang, boy, Mr. Atkinson recalled. I went right to the bottom, right down to the soil. I thought I was gone. Goodbye, adios. But the veteran ironworker cut loose his heavy tool belt and somehow, still wearing his life preserver, made it back up to the surface. I remember the water getting lighter as I came up. Finally, I hit air. What a wonderful feeling that was. Phil Neuton, head of the world-renowned underwater specialists Neutco Research in Vancouver, was a 16-year-old commercial scuba diver. He heard screams over his scanner radio and rushed to the scene. It was chaos, absolute chaos. There was shrieking and groaning and screaming everywhere. I saw 3 bodies laid on the deck. By the time I left 2 hours later, there were 12. The bridge's crane operator survived the steep plunge, but he was trapped in his cab. The incoming tide was up to his neck and rising. He was yelling for help, Mr. Knighton said. We tried everything to save him, but nothing worked. Then I saw his hair floating in the water. There was more to come. The young diver saw a victim hoisted up, face intact, but the back of his skull sheared off. Beneath the water, the diver discovered 2 dead ironworkers anchored to the bottom by the weight of their tools. They were just standing there, bent over. We hooked them up and got them out of there. Gary Poirier, an 18-year-old apprentice ironworker, had just crawled out from inside another girder when he heard the toot-toot of the small locomotive hauling the 55-ton slab of steel. The crane derrick prepared to lift it into place. Just like that, the bridge went down about 5 to 10 feet. A few seconds later, it went all the way down. I must have blacked out. All I remember was coming up out of the water. I was alive. All told, 79 workers were pitched into the water, including painters on the 4th span that also fell when it was dislodged by the force of the 5th span's collapse. Besides the dead, scores were badly injured, spending months in hospital. No survivor suffered more than George Schmidt, a 22-year-old apprentice mate of Mr. Poirier. His bleeding, mangled leg was trapped under a girder. Calmly, he used his tool belt as a tourniquet and lit a cigarette, but medics had to amputate his leg below the knee to free him. He never went back to ironworking, scuffling from job to job until friends lost track of him in California. He had a difficult time in relationships and life, said his case manager at the WCB. We'd call it PTSD today. You lose a leg, you don't regrow it. Mr. Poirier is haunted too. He attributes much of his trouble in later life to the trauma of what happened on the bridge that day. I never really recovered. If I hear an ambulance on a nice day, I break into tears. I got a scar on my left leg. I notice it in the bath sometimes, and it brings everything back. Lou Lessard was on top of the hulking structure when it collapsed. No one fell further. As he hit the water, his leg shattered, his arm broke, and the rest of his body was battered and bruised. You're under the water. You're stunned. You're hurt. It's dark and cold. There's no air to breathe. I was down there for a long time. I'd pretty much given up. Finally, I saw some rays of the sun poking through, and I came up. There was that beautiful bridge of just moments ago, broken in half, and all those guys soaking wet, bleeding and hurt and crying for help. It stays with you for the rest of your life. Those guys had fathers and mothers and neighbors and wives and kids. They're your friends, your buddies. They paid the ultimate price, and we have an obligation to remember them. Bill Moore was working on the bridge that day. There were rivets snapping off and steel grinding against steel. We looked for a place to hide. There was no place to go. Some of the overhead steelwork crashed down on top of the pier and toppled into the water. Scaffolding fell all around us. I didn't see very much, but I could hear what was going on. Then everything was still. I've heard about deafening silences. Now I know what they're like. Most of those descriptions are taken from 10 years ago, the 50th anniversary. George knew that he had to act on this. This was, as he will say in the interview, hidden treasure. A lot of people in BC are quite familiar with George Orr, as I have become. He's devoted his professional life to journalism and telling stories, and he's taken that talent and created The Bridge. But now I will play the interview made on Monday with George Orr, talking about The Bridge. And once again, we welcome to the view up here, Mr. George Orr. Hello, George. How are you?
I'm grand. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing fine. I'm quite willing and honored to help you with this project. I mean, if we look back, just to put the facts out there, June 17th, 1958, the construction of what was then the Second Narrows Bridge collapsed. It's good to see that this is being remembered and memorialized and made a part of permanent history, especially in the Lower Mainland. But I have a question for you off the start. 10 years ago in 2008, at the 50th anniversary, tell me what you were doing then.
Well, I was sort of involved with two distinct approaches to this. I was teaching at BCIT, and a group of BCIT students for a film production did a piece about the Second Narrows Bridge 50 years after it collapsed. And they called it, I think it was 19 Red Roses. A lovely, touching memorial. They interviewed survivors. They had old footage. They had the old CBC News footage and still photographs, and a very touching memorial. Coincidentally, that year, I attended the 50th anniversary at the bridge side, 50 years to the day. and shot some footage for another project entirely that had nothing to do with their project. And I put that footage away and haven't thought about it until just recently, until this latest project jumped up at me.
Now, this latest project, yeah, I think jump is an accurate word, because this is one of those rare finds that you don't hear about too often, and it involves a man named Peter Hall. Tell us about Peter.
Everybody who's ever been a journalist or a storyteller is always looking for the mythical sunken treasure. The mythical sunken treasure is the great story that's waiting to be told, just the undiscovered treasure. Peter Hall, Peter Hall, retired engineer, lives in Parksville. Last July, he and a group of other retired gentlemen put up a flagpole in their retirement community. The local paper wrote a story, a long story. And in the story, Peter mentioned that he'd worked on the Second House Bridge as a draftsman in the 50s, and he had some film. And I read the story, and it was one of those that takes your breath away things. I was thinking, well, maybe he's got 30 seconds of old 8mm film, all kind of crinkly. So I phoned him right away and chatted him up, and he had 3,000 feet of 16mm colored film that had never been entirely screened, ever. He shot it, he put it away for 60 years. He's nursed it along. He shot it when he was 24, 25, and now he's in his mid-80s. And he was quite taken aback that anybody would be interested, so he and I have collaborated and produced a documentary called The Bridge.
I did read that article. It was in the North Shore News, Brent Richter, and I'm just curious about, I mean, you know, you've been there all your life. I can imagine the reluctance to people to, you know, get harkened back to that day, especially with all the unfortunate fatalities. But didn't Mr. Hall try and give this film back, the people who actually wanted him to film it in the first place?
He did. A fellow named Phil Stannard, who was the public relations guy for the Dominion Bridge Company, actually approached Peter and said, will you shoot the film? Peter had been trained to be an engineer, but he was hired on at the bridge as a draftsman. And he was good at drafting, so he could get his day's work done early. So he took his film camera and his color film, and he went out to the project, and his job was to document the construction of the bridge, from the drafting of the paper to the arrival of the material, the steel from England, to the pouring of the footings, to the erection, to the cutting of the ribbon. That was one of his jobs. He was to film everything, which he did. He was 5 minutes late the day of the collapse, because had he been on time, he would have died. He would have been out at the point of the bridge that came down. And when it did come down, the company kind of lost interest in public relations value of this footage, because they'd rather just put it all behind them. So he approached them and said, what do I do with the film? And they said, we don't want it. Not long after that, Dominion Bridge went out of business, became somebody else. Sort of the ownership of the film vanished over the many, many, many decades. And Peter ended up with 3,000 feet of color film in his basement for 60 years.
Yeah, that I agree. That is definitely the sunken treasure. 59 years this film sat. The first time you got to screen it, how did it affect you?
Well, I met Peter at an archivist, a film archivist, restorer in Nanaimo, because he lives just north of Nanaimo. He and I took the film to this guy, and I gave this guy a hard drive, and we had a conversation about doing whatever you're going to do. And Peter went home, and I came home, and about 5 days later, the FedEx guy showed up with a parcel, and I opened it up, and here's the hard drive, and I plugged it in, and I stared at the screen. It's about an hour and a half long film. There's no story to it. It's just pictures and pictures and pictures. But an hour and a half film in which you are up on the bridge, looking down, watching men working 200 feet in the air with no safety harnesses, no nets, and slinging heavy tools, and assembling this giant structure with thousands and thousands of pieces of steel. And it was just, well, awesome is such an overused word, but it really was awesome, because this is as close as one would ever get to be to watch something like this being built. The bridge is a huge bridge. I think it's almost a kilometer long or more. I should know the numbers, but I don't. But it's just a ginormous structure, and you're up watching these guys doing this stuff, and it's breathtaking. In fact, I got vertigo watching some of this stuff, and I'm looking at it on a small screen. So when I finally put it up on a big screen, I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. So I'm dying to see what it looks like in a movie theater.
Well, I certainly understand from your history that as soon as you realized what you had, that something had to be done. Something had to be created to make sure that this film got exposure. Now, tell us about the project that you put together called The Bridge.
Well, I'm not a big believer in serendipity. I don't believe things happen for a reason. I think stuff just happens. And people who work hard get to take advantage of what looks like good luck, but generally it's not. But in this case, it was. I got the footage. I looked at the footage. I have a friend named George Garrett, who's a retired reporter in town. George was a reporter for 43 years, and he covered everything. So over lunch, I said, do you remember the Second Narrows Bridge? Well, it turns out young George Garrett's first major scoop was covering the Second Narrows Bridge because it was an international story. So these young reporters filing stories off to the capitals of the world. So I pulled out the camera and I interviewed him because he was a young guy in his 20s breaking into the news business and when radio was big. He mentioned, did I know a fellow named Hank Sterick, who just retired the police department in Vancouver? Well, Hank was an investigator on the bridge. So I phoned Hank and he talked. And then somebody said, oh, you should talk to the disc jockey, Red Robinson, because he covered it live on air. So I talked to Red. And then having talked to Peter, and there's a fellow named Eric Jameson who's written a sensational book called The Tragedy at Second Narrows. If you're interested at all, Eric Jameson's book is a must-have. But Eric talked to a guy named Gary Poirier, who was a survivor, who went down with the bridge as an 18-year-old steel worker. So I phoned up Gary, and he was most keen to talk and very helpful and very clear memories. So this is the opposite of bragging. I didn't have to work to do this. Things just fell into place. And then as it turned out, and this is the perils of short-term memory loss when you get old, then I remembered that I had shot the event for the 50th. And so I had footage of commemoration and reads and sadness and speeches and stuff that I'd forgotten about that until I was about 2 months into this project, because I've got over 1,000 hours of event stuff I've shot on my own. So I salvaged that, pulled it out, and this story just ended up telling itself.
And it is a story that has a complete human element. I mean, the appeal of this tragedy is quite obvious, and I think it is certainly worth being memorialized in every new medium that we come up with, because that's what should be done with history. Mm-hmm. I must say, I agree. You were rather gratuitous to have the road laid out for you. How long did you spend putting all this together?
Well, I used to work in the daily news business, so the deadline was never that far down the road. But for this, I knew I had that. I started working on it, I guess, late October, and I had to have it done in advance of the 60th anniversary, which is this coming June 17th, which is just a few days from now.
Yeah.
And so with a story like this, the first question is, you're building to a disaster. So for the viewer, do you pretend there's no disaster and then have it come as a surprise? Or they know there's a disaster and you build up to it slowly? Or do you start with the disaster and then go back and then come back to it? So I constructed a rough edit for essentially every one of those narrative paths and a couple of others, and spent a couple of months going back and forth and thinking about what to do and how to do it in the process. And finally came up with the narrative that I have, which is really, it's a character-driven story. It's a story about Peter Hall, the filmer, the draft filmer, the filmmaker, Gary Poirier, the survivor. And so I try to have the story come across in their words as much as possible. Starts with the bridge collapse. And then you kind of back into the story and meet the people, get a sense of the place and time. Because the Second Narrows Bridge was going to essentially fix Vancouver, because the city was relatively full of housing and the North Shore was booming, because in the Second War there were huge shipbuilding industries here. So there was huge housing demand in North Vancouver and West Vancouver. The Lionsgate Bridge at that point was 2 lanes. So the traffic was terrible, much like today. So the government decided in the mid-50s that we needed, for the day, a 6-lane bridge was an enormous structure. It was almost unheard of, but the government decided they wanted that so that more housing could be built on the North Shore because people were moving to Vancouver. It was a land of opportunity, post-war boom. It was a sensational place to be. It was attracting people from all over the world, so open up the North Shore. So that was the genesis of the bridge itself.
Well, I mean, now, for anybody who travels to the Lower Mainland, anybody who looks at the Second Narrows Bridge, and you look at what's on the north side, it's like, well, how can that not be there? How was that never there? You know, and I mean, I've been reading about this, and you look back to the first bridge, which is still being used for rail, and even the way the earlier bridges were built, there were accidents with shipping, there were closures, and I can see the point. At least you have to say that the government of the day had the foresight to not kind of build a replacement for the original bridge across the Second Narrows. They had the foresight to do it. It was a grand plan. It still stands today. It's solid, etc. But isn't this story really about what happens when you get a large group of human beings together with so many decisions and calculations, etc., etc.? Isn't it? Do you have any other explanation for this tragedy other than plain old human error? Is that it?
Well, the science of engineering. I mean, I'm not a technician by nature. I can barely hammer a nail without hitting my thumb at the same time. So I'm not mechanical. It's never been an interest to me. But as I was working on this project, I was chatting with engineers and interviewing people and reading things and reading. The engineering business is a fascinating, intricate business full of tables and designs and stress points and all that stuff. And I'm now getting a layperson's understanding, which makes me respect what they do immensely, because when an engineer builds something less than perfect means people die. A project like this, it could mean a lot of people. I mean, if the bridge went down, right now it carries about 120,000 vehicles a day. If a bridge like that went down in the middle of the day, it's catastrophic beyond imagining. Yeah. So the engineering business is always about being perfect and making sure every contingency is covered. But in this case, back in the 50s, when they were building cantilever bridges out over the water, they put up temporary supports. The temporary supports were not designed to be permanent. Therefore, they didn't require an engineer's stamp. They required an engineer to kind of look at it, check it out, say that's fine, but it didn't. Every other element of the bridge required an engineer to certify beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was going to work, not the temporary supports. So when the bridge was building out past those temporary supports, what happened was one of the pieces of steel was a little thinner than it should have been to carry the weight. Because it wasn't just the bridge at that point. They were putting in new parts of the bridge, and there was a huge crane on top, and all this huge weight on this temporary support that was just a little too weak. And the day that the bridge went down, they were installing a 55-ton beam. So there was the weight of the cantilever stuff, there was the weight of all the men, there was the weight of the steel on the bridge, plus this 55-ton beam that they were reaching out over the water. And at 3:40 in the afternoon, it came down.
A very slim margin. The term for those supports are false works. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're false because it's temporary, and not false because it's, not the negative connotation of false. Just in engineering terms, of false work is something that's temporary. As a result of this accident, engineers all over the world now have to certify all false work, whether it's temporary, false work being temporary. It all is required to have a certification. So this repeated accident, the bridge building business learned huge tragic lessons out of this. Interestingly, the government of the day, under W.A.C. Bennett, who had decided he would help BC expand, they called an inquiry the next day. And the purpose of the inquiry was to very publicly ensure that people understood what happened, would come to understand what happened, and it would not happen again. And there would be no cover-up, and this was not about making this thing go away or making people look somewhere else. They were very clear, because they knew public confidence was supreme, that they would come to the bottom of understanding what happened in this, and they did. Tragically, on the bridge, there were two engineers whose job it was to make sure all the pieces fit together. And one of them, the younger engineer, a fellow named Bill McKibben, was the fellow who had drafted the false work. And so ultimately it was found that Bill's error in drafting the false work was the primary cause of the collapse. And he died on the bridge. He came down when it came down. So young fellow, new family, bright career as an engineer, and he passed. So they found what they identified the problem, they corrected the problem, the bridge was finished, and it still stands.
I wish we had a little bit more of that tenacity out of government these days. You know, I mean, everything I've ever heard about the W.A.C. Bennett days, that's quite typical for his administrations, but I wish we had the same sort of respect for citizens that we used to have back then.
I would agree. Something that I came to realize during the telling of this story. I was a 10-year-old kid living in Toronto at the time, and my parents decided we would drive to the west. So I was car sick for 6 days coming from Toronto to British Columbia. But when you got back then up into the Rocky Mountains and into British Columbia, W.A.C. Bennett was building the TransCanada Highway one bridge at a time. So there wasn't just the one bridge over the Second Narrows being built in the 50s. There were dozens of these bridges, and they're still standing today. This was how Bennett opened up the West. This is how, all of our highway system is in BC. It's all highways, tunnels, and bridges. And the idea that one of these bridges might fail was unthinkable. And because this one failed, everything else that was built and double-checked and triple-checked, the bridges built back then still stand, and they'll stand functionally, for another 100 years, I would imagine. It was a grand time, and you're right. Back then, the government was interested in getting things done properly. They were building an infrastructure so that BC could be grown on top of the infrastructure, and everybody who lives in BC has benefited from that ever since.
Oh, definitely. I would agree. Having taken that route myself from Edmonton, I remember before the Coquihalla, we'd have the wonderful back and forths around the Shuswaps and Salmon Arm, but still there on Highway 1. But I've been over many of those bridges. And yes, it is a testament to the spirit and determination of the government of the day to get it done. That is a very valid point, though. Like you said, it wasn't just Second Narrows. Second Narrows was more or less the crown jewel of the project. So if something went wrong there, yes, drastic action had to be taken.
Yeah. Second Narrows was actually the last link in the TransCanada Highway. Federal government decided after the war that Canada needed a single road, Highway 1, to run the length of the country, 6,000 kilometers. And the last link was the Second Narrows. But, as you mentioned, Coquihalla, W.A.C. Bennett's son, Bill Bennett, decided the Coquihalla Highway would be built because it would be a safer highway, a faster route to the interior. But he required the same pristine engineering standards. So it's through terrible country in terms of weather. Yeah. But the highway itself is, it's a grand piece of road construction. There's, lots of separate lanes, good tunnels, lots of, it's a really, it's a piece of perfection in the highway building business, because young Bennett realized his father had built the primary infrastructure, and so anything he would add to it had to be as good, and it is.
I agree. I think the easiest way to compare it would be if you've driven on any of the so-called state highways in, say, Montana or Idaho. You can see the difference with the Coquihalla.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? Yeah. So it's so I ended up walking into this story. Like, I had no intention to be working on a documentary this year. Wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing, but it wasn't this. But this just this fell into my lap, and it was like it had to be told. I was saddled with this footage, so I had to. The problem I posed for myself was I met Peter Hall and I said, "I'm a documentary storyteller. I will tell this story, and trust me." And that's a big thing to ask of somebody when they have no idea who you are. And trust me meant open your heart, tell me your story, give me your footage, trust that we'll work together. And to his great credit, Peter and I have become good friends. He's a lovely man. And we've worked on this thing collaboratively since last October, and it opens in Vancouver on the 17th. My intention, and I've been very fortunate, the theater that's going to run this will push the button in the projector 60 years to the moment from when the bridge went down.
Oh, that is very poignant.
Yeah, that's serendipity for you.
Yes. I'm curious about Mr. Hall. What kind of attachment did he have to this film? Or was it basically something that had been sitting so long, it's like, yeah, I've got it. Like, how much did it mean to him?
Well, I think the film meant, it was fascinating for him because it was something, he was learning a new craft essentially as a camera person. So he enjoyed that for the period of time that he did it. When he finished, I don't believe he ever took another frame of film in his life. He may have family footage, but I don't know. But he put it away and just, if he hadn't mentioned it as sort of an afterthought to a young reporter on some other story entirely, this would never have happened. But once, how do I put this nicely? Once I got my teeth into Peter and vice versa, this has become a project of some fascination for him because he had this idea all along that something should be done with this. But we've all got something we should do, whether it's paint the back shed or, put up something. We've all got a to-do list we'll never get at. And this was at the top of his he'll never get at to-do list because he's a guy in his 80s and he has no idea about the technology of any of this stuff or the marketing or the storytelling. And so he'd given up the idea that this would ever happen. So I essentially jumped into his life, said, guess what? I'm going to make you a filmmaker. We're going to do this together. Trust me, we're going to do this. He has trusted me. He's coming to the screening. He will talk a little bit about the film before we push the button on the projector. And he doesn't know this yet, but everybody in the theater will come to their feet and applaud him from their hearts for saving this piece of history in Vancouver. And for Peter, who's been an engineer, his notion of having a public presence is pretty well zero. And I'm making him something of a star, and it's tremendous. It's the validation I don't know that he really wants it, but he'll really enjoy it.
Well, just being an outsider, I would say that this must be fantastic closure for Peter.
I hope so, because if I could find a better way to help him be acknowledged for this, I would. And actually, that's what I'm thinking of now. I think I've found a company who will distribute the film and sell it overseas. I think there's a market for this story. Part of the challenge in telling a story is, do you tell a story that's very local, or do you tell the same story that's not local at all? Local meaning, street names and the name of the mayor or whatever. Mm-hmm. Or do you tell a story that people who have very little idea where Vancouver is, do you tell a story for them? Like, where do you aim your narrative? Who's your audience? And I tried to keep this story pretty broad so that if you live here, you get it. If you live in Winnipeg or New York or Memphis, you'd get it. And so I think there's a market for a story like this to be told and seen in a lot of different places. So Peter's going to be more famous than he ever thought.
Well, I would say that, for his benefit to that, he could not have, whether by accident or design, found a better collaborator than you, George Orr. Your work.
Kind. Thank you.
Your work
Thank you.
very much speaks for yourself. Now, tell us about the premiere. Where is it going to be?
There's the Van City Theatre in Vancouver, which is the home of the Vancouver Film Festival. The Van City Theatre in Vancouver is staging the screening on the 17th of June at 3:30 in the afternoon. And if people want tickets, they go to viff.org and type in The Bridge. Currently, there are 5 screenings. They're selling out quickly, and the theater may, in fact, put on more screenings depending on demand. So as the people who listen to this flock to the theater, it'll fill up, but there will be plenty of opportunity. I'm hoping to convince a TV network to carry this. So far, I was told by the CBC, oh no, it's too local. And I thought, well, I won't share what I thought because it's not suitable for broadcast. But and I'm not particularly good at the corporate game of documentary storytelling. There's funding available for established documentary storytellers. You get a broadcaster, you get funding, and it's a mountain of paperwork, and I won't do it because for a production like mine, you really need a staff of about 12 people. You need a camera person and an editor and a producer and a director on scene and a production assistant and a narrator and a writer and a researcher. Well, that's me. And the whole notion that I have to, and then you have to qualify. You have to qualify to be Canadian, and it's an 8-page exercise that takes 2 months to qualify your film to be Canadian. And I mean, I've lived in Canada all my life. I'm the only guy involved. It's Canadian. Oh no, it's not until you fill in the forms. So I'm filling in the forms is not a priority for me. But nonetheless, my intent is to have this seen as broadly as possible. So, and it's undated. I mean, this is a story for today. It's a story that will still be valid in 100 years as people look back on this time. So it'll get an audience. It'll get seen. And, you know, Peter, even after he passes, Peter will be somebody who will be, a minor but fascinating, potent character in BC history.
Well, when you contacted me and asked how much do I know about the Second Narrows disaster, and are you aware that the 60th anniversary is coming, and have you seen this story? There are 3,000 feet of film that's never been seen. Immediately, I was interested. It's like, wow, this, as you said, this is the sunken treasure. This does not happen very often at all. No. What is there any, I know that the name of the bridge was officially changed. I believe it was in 1994 to the Ironworkers Memorial.
Yes.
Is there any ongoing legacy from that, either with the ironworkers themselves or with Vancouver? What I'm trying to get to is, where will anything generated from this documentary you've put together, if it does, once it gets distribution, once it's screened across Canada and maybe internationally, is there any plan for money it will generate? What's going to be done with that?
Well, I'm not sure it's going to generate much money. I've joked with Peter. I said, when we win an Academy Award, you'll have to fly to Hollywood. And he laughed. North Vancouver is opening a brand new museum in 2 years. The history of the North Shore is fascinating, with shipbuilding and logging and resource extraction and all that. And the new museum is at the gem. It's being built on the waterfront at the foot of Lonsdale in North Vancouver. And I've had preliminary conversations with them about this material because, the documentary is 52 minutes. There's a variety of uses this material could be put to tell a story that will educate a community, not just the film that I've made, but there's a variety of different uses in terms of interactive and internet, and I don't really know what they are because I've put my heart into it. But I will ensure that through them, at a minimum, this material will be preserved and displayed, and possibly with the museum in Vancouver. And my interest is in getting this out into so many places in the world that it can't go away. So once this thing is kind of finished its theatrical run, I'll put my back into the heavy lifting involved to do whatever it needs to be done to make sure people know. Canadians, you and I have talked about this before. Canadians don't really seem to value their history. We're interested in other people's history, but we don't really see ourselves that way as much as we should. So I'm on a mission to change all that. I'm not going to be very successful, but it doesn't matter. It's what I'm doing anyway.
Well, actually, I find that to be a very Canadian way to tell a story, by taking a very serious, tragic, real-life event and using it to demonstrate the resilience and the fortitude and the determination of all the people that have come to Canada and continue to come to Canada. I think it's, in the big picture, it's a very Canadian presentation.
That's a lovely way to put it. That's very true. Yeah, I think you're right.
Well, there you go. June 17th, the 60th anniversary of the Second Narrows disaster. Mr. George Orr, this is quite a project. I hope that it really gets seen, and more than that, I hope it really gets remembered and it will become a permanent part of the history.
It would be interesting to think that the city or the region might in some way commemorate this as an annual event. I know the union does, and the union will. Yeah. One of the things that I've not really thought about until very recently is, when I started talking about this project, I started hearing from people who their uncle worked on the bridge, or they were in school and they heard it, or connections with it. I've heard hundreds of these stories. So when the movie starts that afternoon, the theater's going to be full of people for whom this has a huge emotional investment. It's not like they're going to popcorn and watch Star Wars. These are the people that lost an uncle or a grandfather, So there's going to be 200 people watching this film who are going to be heavily emotionally invested in this. And I had not given that any thought at all, except now I'm going to have to get up and talk to those people a little bit and then participate in this great emotional outpouring of whatever happens as they witness this event. So I'm prepared to be, I don't know, sort of emotionally overwhelmed, I think, by this. But I'm glad I got to do it, and I'm very glad I got to talk to you about it. I really appreciate this.
Well, I, for one, appreciate you taking on this project and looking under rocks and putting it together. And once again, I thank you for being on The View Up Here, George.
I appreciate it. I really do. Thanks a lot.
Okay. It's always a pleasure to interview George Orr. Now, after the fact, after what you've heard, the second Narrows is 1,292 meters long. The center span, the cantilever section, is 335 meters. That's over 1,000 feet. Second longest cantilever in Canada to the bridge in Quebec City, and the 15th longest in the world. It is part of the TransCanada, the last over-obstacle item until you get to the tip of the mainland. And then, of course, the TransCanada picks up on Vancouver Island with the final terminus in Victoria. It was 1994 that the name was officially changed to Ironworkers Memorial Second Narrows Crossing. Before, I talked to George after we terminated recording, and he said, you can also find this information in any Vancouver media. Prior to the screening, the Ironworkers local will do their annual commemoration and memorial ceremony at the memorial plaque on the bridge. One last piece to this part of the show. In fact, I will read the 19 names that lost their lives on the second Narrows. Albert Birchall, Sidney Bellevaux, Walter Carter, Joseph Crush, Kevin Duggan, Stanley Gartley, Frank Hinkleton, Rudolph Hogel, Alexander Hawka, Leon Joyal, Alan McPherson, John McKibben, Gordon McLean, Richard Mayo, Percy Moffat, Leonard Mott, Alexander Robertson, Roderick Smith, Alan Stewart, John Thompson, Thomas Warswick, John Wright. Rest in peace, gentlemen. I hope that the screenings go very well in Vancouver from the 17th onward, as long as they can sell tickets for it. Van City will continue to show it. And then I am certainly hoping that it hits Canada-wide distribution. It would be very interesting. Having spent my fair share of time well over 100 feet in the air, I can't think of those conditions. No harnesses, no safety lines. I know how heavy iron worker belts are. To work at 60 meters above the water, without a harness, without a safety line, and be wearing anywhere up to 50 to 70 pounds of tools. And to do this work takes a special kind of worker. Unfortunately, the collapse shows the downside. But these men deserve to be remembered. Good luck with the film, George and Peter, and I hope to be able to see it later on this year where I am, and everyone else for that matter. The Bridge. George Orr and Peter Hall. Now, on to the second part of the show. The Ontario election is over. Majority government for the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, led by now Premier Designate Doug Ford. Yes, Doug Ford. I didn't want to get into too much of the stuff that everybody's seen everywhere else. The pointing fingers, the quote-unquote analysis. I just wanted to concentrate on the more things change, the more they stay the same, for the most part. But I'll start off with talking about the turnout. 58%. Well, you know, if you ask me, 58% doesn't sound like a whole hell of a lot. But it was the strongest in nearly 2 decades. The strongest since 1999. More than 5.7 million of the 10.2 million eligible to vote. That's a milestone for Ontario, which has never had more than 5 million people show up for a provincial election. It was 51% turnout in 2014. It was 48% in 2011. The all-time high for Ontario was 74.4%, but that was ancient history, 1898. Turnout was around 60% for most of the 70s and 80s until 1999, when it dropped to 58.3%, and Mike Harris got his second term. What a coincidence. More people than usual took advantage of early voting as well. Almost 800,000 people voted at advanced polling stations, compared to 650,000 who voted early in 2014. That's roughly 13% of total ballots cast. As far as the use of electronic tabulating machines and e-poll books go, which is a digital version of the voters list, I think judgment on that will take a while. I mean, Elections Ontario, like every elections board, has a fair amount of work to do after the vote. It's not just conducting the vote. We'll see what happens. What have I noticed so far about the result overall? This is the best advertisement for electoral reform Canada has ever seen. 40% of 58% gave 100% of the power to Doug Ford and the PCs. So 40% of 58, we're talking barely more than 1 in 5 eligible voters in Ontario made a majority government. Gotta love first past the post. Nobody's surprised that Doug Ford won. He was expected to. If the election would have been 3 weeks earlier than it was, he probably would have had a much bigger majority. We'll see if that trend continues once government is convened. What I wanted to talk about was, quote-unquote, Team Ford. Now, we can go back to the election campaign, and there's a certain previous employment record that is common with a lot of these people. Doug Ford's campaign manager was Corey Tanique, a former vice president of the Sun News Network. He's worked for the Federal Progressive Conservatives, Reform, and Canadian Alliance parties, including in then Reform leader Preston Manning's office as official leader of the opposition. He's also worked as director of the Conservative Caucus Research Bureau. All parties have a research bureau, which are more colloquially known as dirty trick squads. He was communications director to Prime Minister Stephen Harper and chief spokesperson for the Conservatives' 2015 campaign. Provincially, he's a former senior policy advisor to then Ontario Premier Mike Harris and has worked on various campaigns, including in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Outside of politics, he's been executive director of the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association and more recently a director with Coriolis Public Affairs. Second to Mr. Tanique on the Ford campaign is campaign director Michael Diamond, who was the campaign manager for Ford's PC leadership bid. He's worked on campaigns for the Manitoba and Nova Scotia PC parties, was deputy campaign manager to then Ontario MPP Peter Sherman in 2007. He was director of operations to Rob Ford's successful 2010 mayoral campaign and was part of Conservative MP Kelly Leach and her recent federal leadership campaign. Former Ontario PC Party Vice President Dean French is the chair of Ford's campaign. He's previously been a fundraiser for Rob Ford, an organizer and senior advisor to then Canadian Alliance leader Stockwell Day. He ran unsuccessfully for a seat on Toronto City Council in 2014. He's a former president of the Etobicoke Lakeshore Conservative Riding Association. Now, National Public Relations Managing Partner Chris Froggatt is the vice chair, was the vice chair of Doug Ford's campaign. A former advisor to Preston Manning as official opposition leader, he went on to work for Ernie Eves' PC government and later the opposition team at Queen's Park, starting as a senior advisor to then Transport Minister Brad Clark and later becoming executive assistant to then Ontario MPP John Baird. Mr. Froggatt returned to the Hill to serve as Baird's chief of staff as a minister under the Harper government from 2006 to 2010. Michael Crace is the executive director of the Ontario PC Party. He's a well-known Ontario organizer and campaign manager, including heading Conservative MP Tony Clement's brief 2017 federal leadership campaign. Here's one you may know. Jenny Byrne, Jenny the Impaler, will be a target seat director on the campaign, focused on mapping out key ridings for the team to target. Ms. Byrne is a former senior advisor, Director of Issues Management, and Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper, and ran the Conservative Party's 2011 and 2015 election campaigns. She was also in the Federal Party's 2008 campaign war room and later served as the Conservative Party's Director of Operations. On the campaign, Ms. Byrne will be working closely alongside her successor as Conservative Party Operations Director, Fred Delory, who's been tapped to serve as the Get Out the Vote Director for Mr. Ford. A former Communications Director for the Federal Conservatives, Mr. Delory ran unsuccessfully as a candidate for the Federal Party in Central Nova Scotia in 2015. He was campaign manager to Conservative MP Aaron O'Toole during his leadership bid, and more recently ran Ontario PC leadership candidate Christine Elliott's campaign. And he has also previously served as an Atlantic advisor to Stephen Harper. Ian Todd was the director of Mr. Ford's tour. He was director of tour for former Conservative Minister Jason Kenney's Alberta leadership campaign and was director of Mr. Harper's national tours during the 2008, 2011, and 2015 federal elections. He's a former policy analyst to Brian Mulroney, a former deputy chief of staff to Mr. Manning, a former chief of staff to Mr. Day as leader, and a former chief of staff to then BC Liberal Premier Gordon Campbell. He has also been chief of staff to then Human Resources Minister Monty Solberg and then Heritage Minister James Moore. I must say, Mr. Todd, that's quite a list of former employers. They all seem to have something in common. I can't quite put my finger on it. What is this? Okay. Alrighty then. Melissa Lanceman is the head of the War Room Communications for the Ford campaign, a senior director at CIBC Capital Markets for the last 2 years up until January. Previously director of communications to former Conservative Finance Minister Joel Oliver, and at the federal level also worked for then Foreign Affairs Minister Lawrence Cannon, then Trade Minister Peter Van Loan, and then Environment Minister Peter Kent. Ms. Lanceman is also a former senior advisor for public affairs for Coca-Cola Canada and was part of Caroline Mulroney's recent leadership campaign. Well, isn't that just a stellar group of people? It's obvious where the machine came from. Just to have something to put into chat here. So that's the team. We see the results. A PC majority with Ford, the Premier designate. What about the people who are running for Ford? Well, first of all, I'd just like to say that last article was from the Hill Times, written by Laura Rickewart. Thanks, Laura. Another good article. Now from Marika Walsh in iPolitics, ex-Harper MPs and staffers win big in Ontario election. Of the 5 former MPs and 6 former staffers, only 1 didn't win the seat they were going for. The 5 former MPs, Paul Calandra, 1 in Markham-Stouffville, Darrell Cramp, 1 in Hastings-Lennox and Addington, Parm Gill, 1 in Milton, Greg Rickford, 1 in Kenora, Rainy River, and Susan Trupp, lost in London North Centre. But Conservatives going from the back offices to the caucus benches were even more successful, with all of them winning. Stephen Lecce, 1 in King Vaughan. David Piccini, 1 in Northumberland, Peterborough South. Amanda Simard, 1 in Glengarry, Prescott Russell. Jeremy Roberts, 1 in Ottawa West, Nepean. Lindsay Park, 1 in Durham. And Andrea Kanjan, 1 in Barrie, Innisfil. So that's 5 former Harper MPs now in the Ontario legislature, and 6 former staffers of the Conservatives. So what about getting down to business? What about the transition team? Well, it's basically run by 2 people, and you're going to be really surprised who they are. This is again from Marika Walsh in iPolitics. After a decisive majority victory last Thursday night, the PC leader wasted no time Friday announcing the team that will help his party move from opposition and into government. They will be sworn in on June 29th. Chris Froggatt, John Baird's longtime federal chief of staff, will chair the transition team. A managing partner at National Public Relations, Froggatt has been on leave throughout the election to serve as the campaign's vice chair. He and Baird go all the way back to Queen's Park under the Mike Harris and Ernie Eves governments. After they lost power, Froggatt worked with Baird on the opposition benches. When Baird went federal, so did Froggatt. Ford has high praise for Froggatt at his first press conference with reporters as Premier-designate, describing him as one of the smartest people I've ever worked with in politics. Ford added that he appreciates the leadership he's shown not only through the campaign, but as he'll show in the transition team. Now, John Baird did not have a formal role on the campaign team, but played a central fundraising and rallying role in the lead up to the provincial election. Because candidates were not allowed at fundraisers, someone like John Baird was a crucial asset for the PCs. According to a source with the campaign, he took part in more than 30 fundraisers and was doing what he could to get Ford elected. I love that term, doing what he could. Ford also appointed his longtime ally and campaign chair, Dean French, to be his chief of staff of the Premier's office. No new faces. Once that government is about to be sworn in, there's going to have to be a cabinet. Who's in the running for Doug Ford's cabinet? Well, again, thank you, Marika Walsh. At a May 28th roundtable with candidates, Caroline Mulrooney and Christine Elliott flanked Ford on either side. There were 11 other candidates on hand as well. Those included incumbent MPPs Lisa MacLeod, Vic Fedeli, and Raymond Cho, as well as newcomers Doug Downey, Sandy Bellows, Greg Rickford, Rod Phillips, Peter Bethlen-Falvey, Donna Skelly, Roshan Nalaratnam, and Michael Parza. Now, only two of them did not win on election night. That would be Sandy Bellows and Roshan Nalaratnam. Elliott and Mulroney were both leadership contenders and were pulled in to help the main campaign in the final week. Phillips and Bethlen-Falvey both have deep experience in business and management positions. And while they were recruited as star candidates under former leader Patrick Brown, they retained those titles under Doug Ford. Fedeli and MacLeod are both longtime members of the legislature, who the party frequently relied on in the last few months to speak on its behalf during turbulent times. So that was a very good clue. Ontarians are going to be familiar with all those names. They may be groaning or shaking their head, but they know who they are. From 3 days ago, in the CBC, Mark Gollum. When Doug Ford unveils his Ontario provincial government cabinet, it is expected to be much smaller than the current team from Kathleen Wynne. Wynne's final cabinet expanded the number of ministers to 30, but with Ford's focus on finding quote-unquote efficiencies in government, narrowing down the size of cabinet may be one of his first acts. Chad Rogers is a public affairs strategist and founding partner at Crestview Strategy. I wouldn't expect more than a dozen people. I assume it's going to be really small. So that means we'll see amalgamations of ministries. Well, I will say, just from experience here in Alberta, that was tried before by the Notley government. And 3 or 4 months later, it turns out, well, that was just the first half of the cabinet. I believe she started with 12 or 13. I believe the Alberta cabinet is now around 25 or 26. Government is a beast. It can't be run by a handful of people, even from a governing party. Just doesn't work, especially in the most populous province of Canada. Again, remember that stat that I came out with on the final show before the election. You take the population of Ontario, you take the population of the rest of Canada except for Quebec. So 7 provinces and 3 territories. 8 provinces and 3 territories. That total is only 150,000 more than Ontario by itself. So this talk of a cabinet of 12, I think, is just ridiculous. It's impossible. But who's going to be there? If anyone's a shoo-in for cabinet, it's Christine Elliott, runner-up in the leadership campaign who actually won the popular vote. She's a lawyer by trade, a former member of the legislature, who will return to Queen's Park representing Newmarket Aurora. She is expected to snag one of the high-profile cabinet positions. Caroline Mulroney, a so-called star candidate who unsuccessfully vied for leadership. She will be a rookie member representing the Toronto riding of York Simcoe. Like Elliott, she is also considered a shoo-in for cabinets. Vic Fatelli. Vic considered running in the leadership race, but instead took over as interim leader following the ouster of Patrick Brown. He could also find himself in cabinet. Chances for the former mayor of North Bay and the member for Nipissing may also be bolstered by Ford's indication he would like to focus on the north and develop the Ring of Fire. Peter Bethlenfalvy, a rookie member who will represent Pickering-Uxbridge. He may not only score a cabinet post, despite his lack of political experience, but he very well may be given the role of Minister of Finance. He was a senior vice president of Manulife Financial and president and chief operating officer of TD Securities USA. Gee, no similarity there to Bill Morneau at all. Rod Phillips, a rookie member and a star candidate, will represent Ajax. He has been CEO of the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation and CEO of Post Media. He was rumored to be making a run for the leadership. Instead, he declined, throwing his support behind Caroline Mulroney. Lisa MacLeod, a party stalwart and a high-profile member of the legislature. MacLeod is one of the automatics for a cabinet role. A high-profile member. Sure. She has been compared to John Baird, lucky her, for not being afraid to launch an attack from the front bench. Yeah, okay. Who else may be in line? Toby Barrett, Haldeman Norfolk, Raymond Cho, Scarborough North. They both supported Ford's bid for leadership very early. And there's also a good chance that Greg Rickford will get in as well. So all those names, all those connections that I've mentioned about the Ford team, the Ford transition, the first Ford cabinet, what's the common thread? Stephen Harper, Conservative Party of Canada. Good luck, Ontario. This is what you chose. I don't know if it's really the time to mention, something that I think is a strategy for the conservatives in this country. They believe their way back to power in Ottawa is through the provinces. That's why Jason Kenney's in Alberta. That's why somebody like Doug Ford became the leader in Ontario, not Christine Elliott. In my opinion, if Christine Elliott became the leader of the PCs, there's no way the opposition would be as big as it is. There's no way that 20-point lead would have disappeared. Look at the world we're in today. Doug Ford is their kind of guy. Anybody who repeats the same senseless 10 lines over and over for a month and still wins is the Conservative Party's kind of guy. Andrew Scheer needs lessons, granted. We'll see what happens. They've got 2 weeks before they'll probably leak it, who's getting what, because that's just part of the strategy these days. A leak is never a leak when it comes from inside. It's a plant. But hey, whatever. We'll wait, we'll hang on, we'll see how it turns out. Good luck, Trillium Province. The Bridge, from George Orr. June 17th, Fan City Theatre. Many screenings after that. On the show page, there's a link to the trailer for the film. There's a link to getting tickets for the screenings in Vancouver. I'm looking forward to it, even though of its tragic events within it. This is going to be a very interesting. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in, people. I really got nothing else to say tonight, so I'm not going to waste time. Next week, someone I have been looking forward to getting on the show for quite some time. If everything stays the way it's going, June 20th will be that day. Robin Allen, economist, executive, intervener to the National Energy Board. Very well respected economist and, what's the right word? Editorialist and journalist will join me. And we'll talk about this never-ending macabre production called Kinder Morgan and Trans Mountain expansion. Very much looking forward to talking to Ms. Allen. Was fortunate enough to meet her in Toronto before we do this interview, when I was lucky enough to see the screening for Directly Affected. I saw Robin Allen and Mike D'Souza and the director of the film. Something else for you to look into if you're interested in TMX. Directly Affected is the name of the film. 5 years in the making. Another great documentary. Regardless, Robin and I have yet to nail down exactly what we're going to talk about, but I hope to bring you a very entertaining and informative 2 hours with her next week. And that's all I'm going to talk about for the future. The Bridge, June 17th, 60th anniversary of the disaster at the Ironworkers Memorial, Second Narrows Crossing. I hope it's across Canada very soon. Thanks to George Orr. Thanks to everybody for listening. We'll see you next week. That's it for the View Up Here. Good night.